let me start by saying how honored I am to have been again invited to deliver a key lecture here in Ljubljana, and to express my deepest gratitude to the entire organizing team for having invited me. Yes, to be here in Ljubljana is always such a pleasure to be, and where some important contemporary thinkers about comedy like Professor Jure Gunther and Alenka Zupančić come from. Thank you indeed for this opportunity to more thoroughly develop my argument, since it concerns a rather complex, although not necessarily a very fashionable and popular topic, namely the archetypal quality of the classical or classicist comedy and its eventual contemporary uses and or reverberations. I decided to address this question since the very issue of the survival of comedy, which suggests both the obstacles this survival encountered and the actual resilience of the genre, necessarily presupposes taking account of its folk historical arch, in order to then be able to discuss its modern, or should I say, postmodern or post-dramatic, or no longer dramatic reformulations. Am I touching perhaps something? Okay. Now I am aware that the focus duplicated, which is a topic, comedic topic. Can I again start the yeah. I'm aware that the focus of the symposium was meant to be on theatre comedy, and that I could have perhaps picked up the topic of contemporary mise-en-scène of classical comedies, but I chose to discuss a relatively strange or rare case of a theatre within film, for two interconnected reasons. The first one being, of course, the fact that the film I'm going to talk about, Alceste, a bicyclette, reinterprets one of Molière's most famous pieces, Misanthrope, about which I have for a long time dreamt to debate on such occasion as this one is. But the second, more generally relevant reason has to do with meta-theatrical and meta-generic implications of this transmedial hybrid. That is, in this specific case, with the fact that the film I chose engages in the explicit and implicit reflection upon the pertinent features, the legacy and the eventual appeal a classical comedy could have for the contemporary audience, whether in the theatre or in the cinema. Now, the 350th commemoration of Molière's death, which this year follows the previous, more joyful anniversary, 400th one of the playwright's birth, certainly prompts one to remember that the French actor and author is deemed to have invented a new kind of comedy, called in French la grande comédie, or in English high comedy, although the latter term does not exactly match the sense of the French coinage, since it does not necessarily mean a comedy of the salon, but mostly refers to more lofty or more serious, satirical and other ambitions that Molière wanted to attribute to what was in his time considered to be a lower-ranked genre, nearing the vulgarity of the farce. Let me therefore remind you that although the playwright himself never refrained from absorbing farcical features and episodic moments into his plays, such as Lazis and other comedic situations from Commedia dell'arte, combining them with the rules of the construction of the plot and with the endless permutations of several stock elements inherited from Plautus and Commedia erudita, Molière added to these not only the length of a 5-act play, but also rhetorically and philosophically demanding tirades, often, however, also shattering the joyful logic of the genre by thwarting intended marriages, as in Les Femmes Savantes, or by making the plot lead to closely escaped tragic endings, as in Tartuffe, or indeed by introducing truly faithful, unhappy ones, in which, as in Don Juan, characters do die on the stage, or rather under it, since Don Juan is, as you know, ineluctably pulled by the commander into the underworld. One of the most representative pieces and the most commented upon of this new, more complex, if not even, so to speak, more realistic genre, this is a very unfortunate word, which came to be called Comédie de Caractère, and which was conceived to match the status of tragedy Molière never had the chance to excel in, despite his initial fervent efforts, remains to this day The Misanthrope, a play that generated numerous and harshly conflicting interpretations whose sheer number made its contradictory protagonist Alceste rank among the kin of Shakespeare's Hamlet, being equally susceptible, as John Simon would put it, to become an emblematic embodiment of the various sensibilities of individuals in different eras, indeed of the collective sensibilities of these eras themselves. End of quote. It is indeed not inappropriate to evoke here the most famous of all theatre characters in the Western tragic tradition, since Alceste and Hamlet do share many traits. First of all, the most disturbing state of mind. Disturbing, that is, for the surrounding characters, and in Alceste's case, for the very spirit of comedy, namely melancholy. Just as Hamlet, Alceste also feels and craves isolation from its immediate and broader social circle. He also accuses the woman he loves of coquettishness and betrayal. And he also, just as Hamlet, cultivates a keen interest in and refinement in matters of ethics and aesthetics. We could even say that he as well harbors suicidal thoughts, for hanging oneself is the idea that reappears a couple of times during the course of the play, if we did not have reasons just as strong to realize that all this fussing about the perniciousness of the human nature is to a large extent symptomatic of a ridiculous, choleric, and narcissistic self-dramatization, a generically misplaced perception the hero has of himself as a misfit and tragic outcast, eagerly in fact yearning to be distinguished by the very society that he rejects, and loved by the woman who incarnates all the mundane evils that he so adamantly condemns. Knowing that Molière himself has played the part only adds to the suspicions that melancholy is perhaps not the dominant mode of the piece, that the actor's interpretation must have contributed to farcical situations and performative accents the comedy also contains. The battle of the sexes, the quarrel between the would-be tyrant and a clever woman who deceives him. The expressive miming and extravagant gestures suggested to be accompanying Alceste's abrupt comings and goings before and after his quarrelsome confrontations. And yet, as Andrew Calder hurries to add after having enumerated these farcical aspects of the misanthrope, the comedy also displays some of the structural features of tragedy. For characters in farce and tragedy equally are victims of their own temperaments. Their inflexibility is a kind of fate. In the misanthrope specifically, they are so saddled with their particular temperaments and worldviews that no amount of affection and love can change them. End of quote. And knowing indeed what kind of fate awaits Alceste and Célimène, we have to admit that, after all, instead of following the age-old comic formula and celebrating a happy marital union, they do end up being almost tragically ill-matched, and therefore have to separate, leaving the stage to a more auspicious marriage between Célimène's cousin Eliante and Alceste's friend Philette. Ever since the 1950s, theatre directors, as also a couple of cinematic ones, delighted in putting the play on stage or filming it in modern dress. often, however, in order to emphasize precisely its gloomy, if not downright tragic undertones, as Patrice Pavis recently pointed out in his commentary on the 3 most prominent theatre versions of the play in the new millennium, by Jean-Pierre Miquel et Comédie Française, de Colombier in 2000, by Stéphane Braunschweig, Théâtre National de Strasbourg, 2003, and by Clément Hervieux-Léger in particular, with Comédie Française in 2017. Michael Edwards wrote about the same phenomenon, this pessimism, this gloomy interpretation, in his recently re-edited book titled Molière, Laughter, le rire de Molière, in which he exposes such attempts at pessimistically reconfiguring the comedy to be a result of an error of interpretation that thoroughly misses the original comic point of the misanthrope, which was, after all, to make Molière's contemporaries laugh at their own inadequacies, both as individuals and as members of a highly ritualized and therefore necessarily hypocrite society. Now, this proneness to take Alceste in particular seriously is a tendency said to be stemming from the notorious attack on Molière's cruel ridiculing of the protagonist mounted by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, whose admiration for Alceste is often evoked as a mark of a new republican sensibility. But when encountered today, it makes one wonder where and why the hilarious aspect of the comedy vanished, and whether this propensity for tears over the misunderstood loner and the love gone wrong is a sign of our times, whether it testifies to a kind of moralistic sentimentalism and the current impossibility to actually humorously confront the very mixed feelings generated by the play's intricacies, let alone to savor its hidden meta-dramatic irony, the fact, namely, that it is Alceste who embodies and exhibits the tragic seriousness, idealism, inflexibility, intolerance, isolation, nested into the texture, the situations, the sociability, and the playfulness of a comedy. The entire history of the critical reception of the play could, to be sure, figure as such a sign of the not-so-changing times. For even well before Rousseau, from the very start of the stage fortune of the misanthrope, rare have been the members of the public who have found this comedy funny. So I think that misanthrope could also rank among the failures Professor Gunther will talk about tomorrow. So that for long it suffered a moderate success in the theatre, and was even proclaimed to be more of a good reading than a title promising an enjoyable performance. Such a critical stance of both the public and the critics of Molière's age, according to Lionel Gossman, could itself be considered as a proof of their own melancholic disposition. On many accounts, Alceste managed to intimately relate to the 17th century spectator, representing, as the protagonist does, a rightful, if not righteous, melancholic resentment of the domesticated nobility, which reluctantly acquiesced to the rules of Louis XIV's court, where sickness and melancholy were not abided, and any public manifestation of withdrawal was considered to be inadmissible, a provocation, a dangerous indication of dissidence and potential subversiveness. End of quote. Since Molière was, however, dependent upon the king's protection and therefore expected to subscribe to all the aims of the new absolutist state, according to Gossman at least, he simply had to make this type appear as a comic figure, much like the rest of his comic paternal tyrants, who are all, like Alceste, I quote, preoccupied with conservation and retention, dead set against novelty, mobility, change and exchange, the circulation of goods and of money, the free circulation of women and of science, everything that might unsettle the established order of things, end quote. Nevertheless, Many later critics of Misanthrope continued to be puzzled by the ambiguities that permeate the play and hardly tolerated themselves not taking sides when it comes to the principal character, and with it, the generic atmosphere he generates. Judging from the accumulated interpretations, one often simply has to choose. Either the protagonist is a misogynistic, irrational choleric, the society which he attacks because of its hypocrisy is in the right, and the piece is a comedy, or Alceste is an upright and truthful man, and as we heard, a politically subversive, melancholic, the society outrageously unjust, and the piece is a drama with an almost tragic ending. No wonder such an ambiguity proved to be a favorable ground for a fine typology proposed by the psychoanalytic critic Francesco Orlando, who saw in these contentions various manifestations of the effects of comic repression of the seriousness of the issues at stake. As you can see, variant A, the serious content is recognized unconsciously, but the comic structure prevails and represses it. In the variant B, the serious content is conscious, but not accepted, refuted, and the comic structure precariously wins over. In the variant C, the serious content is conscious and accepted, but not advocated, but the comic structure is treated as just a facade. And the variant D, the serious content is advocated, accepted, conscious, but not, let's say, authorized by the interpretive community. Now, I do not have enough time here to enter into the details of his argumentation, so let me just point out that, according to Orlando, the astonishing number of critics find hard to come to terms with the variants A and B, in which there is a precarious balance between the comic and the serious, whether the latter is repressed or acknowledged, and rather opt for the rest of the two, in which the seriousness prevails, regardless of the fact that Orlando's analysis manages to prove to what extent the variants C and D are rather difficult to back up by the close structuralist reading that he provides in his study. Be that as it may, the play stirred such opposite reactions due largely also to two strange couplings in which the protagonist is placed. The first an amical, and the second an amorous one, in such a way that the aforementioned siding of the audience often depends upon sympathies it cultivates for either the unwaveringly offended Alceste on one side, or his socialite companions on the other. Philinte, his wise but somewhat complacent friend, and the gossip-mongering Célimène, the woman Alceste claims to be in love with. Now, no matter how important Célimène's role turns out to be as the play progresses, paired with her cousin Eliante as the alternative lover vengefully courted for a moment by Alceste, it is the opposition between the two men that mostly divided the critics, so notoriously that it has even been taken as an example of scholarly absurdities by Proust's Albertine in À l'ombre des jeunes filles en fleurs. If Alceste is seen as pure and truthful soul, as Goethe pronounced him, then Philinte becomes the flatterer, a false-hearted man of the world, the personification of egoism, craven compromise, and self-satisfaction. If, on the other hand, Alceste is perceived as sour-tempered, then Philinte becomes the man to be preferred as a friend, or, as Norman Humphrey would formulate it, the wise man, whom one would do well to strive to emulate, full of that breeding and discerning politeness found in the best company. End of quote. That is also why the first scene of the comedy, the eloquent confrontation of the raging Alceste and the composed Philinte, which is considered to represent what Humphrey calls the philosophical bone of contention worried over by the two friends, end of quote, has to this day fared as the scene that sets the tone for the whole piece. so much so that the way any director or production crew decides to interpret it often also provides the key to both the characterological and the generic frame in which the whole performance is to be read and experienced. Furthermore, it is precisely with this scene that Louis Jouvet, the legendary actor and director of the early 20th century French cartel of directors, begins his book Molière et la comédie classique, in which he bestows his lessons on acting. The first chapter of the book is in fact entirely devoted to the first scene of the misanthrope, which when performed should, in Jouvet's view, primarily not only establish the often totally neglected and yet pivotal and complex amicable relationship between the two men, but also give space and breadth to the inexpressible and enigmatic aspect of the two characters, who for him held equal importance for the play's universe. Philinte being, according to him, the more intelligent and more knowledgeable man in matters of social intercourse, the one who exhibits protection of his friend, and Alceste being more intrepid in his insistence to bring his beloved woman back to her senses. Jouvet famously insisted on actors simply enunciating the words in the right rhythm and with the right respiration. He urged his students to let go of any preconceived ideas of what the verses might mean, and declared the following. No one will ever be Alceste. Alceste is a character who existed before us and will exist after we are long gone. At the age of 70, when you shall become an actor of stature and a man of stature, since one has to be a man of stature to play Alceste, you shall play Alceste, but you will not be Alceste. You will die, and Alceste will live. Is then Alceste still alive? Has the comedy he dominates survived Jouvet himself? Are we moderns capable of bypassing Rousseau's dictum on the piece in order to rather recognize in the protagonist what Hans Robert Jauss called the paradox of the misanthrope? That is, both his ridiculous and his subversive aspect. Jauss's study is worth recalling since he rightly points out to the special case of misanthrope as a character. The fact that to feel oneself the enemy of mankind would go against nature and the social condition of human existence, end of quote. Which means that a literary creation of such character type represents a limiting case created to test and explore what human nature is, and thus a chance for a contemporary critic to observe the very changing horizons of characterology which underpins comedy as a classical genre. A trajectory that leads from classical anthropology via the Christian conception of human nature and its secularized 19th and 20th century variants to its contemporary vicissitudes. It is with this literary, anthropological, critical, and in Jouvet's case, acting pedagogic background in mind that the French film director Philippe Leguet and actor Fabrice Lucchini, aged 72, decided to envisage a sort of cinematic remake of Molière's Misanthrope, which would primarily, as it appears from the plot, concentrate upon the unlikely friendship of the two contrasting characters. The righteous, intransigent, impatient, angry, jealous, and self-obsessed loner, moralist and aesthete Alceste on one hand, and the good-humoured, polite, confident, amused conversationalist and somewhat cynical honnête homme that is typical French salonier, Philinte on the other. Instead, however, of simply transposing Molière's comedy into contemporary ambience, dress and manners, which would require finding some justification for the use of Alexandrine, much more easily accepted as a convention when the play is modernized on the stage, the authors made the two characters become contemporary theatre, film and TV actors. Serge and Gautier. Serge and Gautier. not only displayed the same character traits, Serge, played by Lucchini, as Alceste, and Gautier, played by Laurent Wilson, as Wieland, but also competing to interpret, in the theatre production mounted by Gautier, either the preeminent, colourful and contradictory Alceste, or the usually bland and secondary Wieland, who may as a character appear to be as complex and fare much better in the society of Molière's times, but is generally not perceived either as an acting challenge or as a role that brings spotlight, whether on or off the stage. The situation becomes all the more comically incongruous since the seemingly well-intentioned Gautier, whom we see to be a highly popular and well-paid actor in soap operas, is the one who, eagerly wanting to finally interpret Alceste, besieges Serge, experienced theatre actor, to agree to play Wieland in his production. Although Serge voluntarily retired some time ago from the acting profession and, disgusted by the entire cultural industry, retreated in a true Alcestian manner to a kind of desert island, l'île de Ré, where he lives in a destitute house without enough money to pay even for the rotten sewer pipes. Serge plays hard to get, and Gautier is forced to stay on the island in order to win him over, initially agreeing that they alternate the roles, at least while rehearsing, but finally suddenly deciding that he will be the one to play Alceste, upon which decision, however, Serge falls in one of his typical tantrums, refuses the deal, and vengefully blunts to Gautier's wife that her husband cheated on her with the attractive Italian Francesca, played by Maya Sansa, who also came to the island in need of some peace after her divorce. One can recognize in her the contemporary variant of Célimène, or should we say Eliante, since it is the only actual erotic triangle involving the two friends in the original misanthrope. Although herself a moralist, much like Eliante, who also admires Alceste but finally marries Wieland, the freshly divorced Francesca shares with Célimène her former marital experience, independent spirit, aloofness and mystery, as well as the charm she has for Serge, who turns to be somewhat clumsy and awkward in matters of love, just like Alceste, not to speak of the jealousy he feels for Gautier for his repeated love affairs and easygoing manners with women, besotted as they all turn out to be by the latter's fame and money. Through its ironic, meta-theatrical redoubling of comic constellations inherited from Molière, the plot thus redeploys the narcissistic subtext of the comedy diagnosed by Lacan to be a kind of madness shared by the entire society and comically denied of having been subjected to by the protagonist. A madness, we may add, only growing in size and perniciousness in a neoliberal epoch, and its Société du Spectacle, as French situationists would call it, much worse than, in that respect, than the French 17th century aristocratic milieu. Besides featuring the aforementioned parallelisms in the construction of the protagonist and his social interactions, as also in the meagre plot that only serves to make the characters emerge as ridiculously self-centered, this cinematic reenactment of the misanthrope's entanglements, like the original, does not refrain from farcical moments, sights of lascivious canvases that Serge paints in his hours of solitude, repeated falls of both friends into the river while riding old-timer bicycles, sudden fights with annoying taxi drivers, etc. Besides, however, the telling structural analogies and inversions with respect to the original comedy, the film also hides a subtle melancholic undertone, whose origin cannot be reduced solely to the fatal misunderstanding between Serge and his social environment, let alone to his lost chances for renewed professional affirmation and emotional fulfillment. The somewhat smuggled topic of the film concerns mainly the issue of age. The human age, of course, but also the age, the kind of epoch in which humans happen to be forced to realize their humanity and their nature. In the original Misanthrope, let me remind you, apart from preaching ultimate sincerity in human relationships, Alceste also appears to be an inadvertent laudator temporis acti. Not only he rejects Auron's love sonnet by extolling the worth and beauty of traditional folk poetry as a counterexample, but he also, as we have already said, cultivates a misplaced perception of himself as a heroic and tragic outcast from society, as a kind of archaic Cornelian hero seeking spectacular martyrdom, who then inevitably turns out to be grotesquely unfitting for the comedic, primarily social and conversational context of a woman's salon. Alceste's conservatism is, however, all too often automatically linked to his supposed middle age, which is an interpretive assumption fortified by critics' knowledge that Molière himself was 44 when he acted the role. Not all of the critics, however, agree on that point, concurring in this respect with Lionel Bosman, who also insists on Alceste's paradoxical youth, paradoxical since, as we've heard, the protagonist in many respects occupies the comedic slot of the old man, lusting after an inappropriate young woman. The Serbian theatre scholar Ivan Medenica, who, by the way, also sees the Misanthrope as a tragedy of initiation, as he calls it, argues that there are plenty of reasons indeed for assuming that Alceste is very young, a man in his 20s, since he is courting a very young woman of the same age, and being free from any family or social obligations is allowed to display the kind of intolerant temperament which is entirely fitting for a young, impassioned nature, prone to reject social hypocrisies, and apparently so different from Wieland in behavior only insofar the latter is more mature and therefore also protective and caring of his younger friend. That is Medenica's thesis. Now, the situation in the film is to a large extent inverse. Serge and Gautier seem to be peers, but here Serge, the actor supposedly sharing Alceste's nature, is the one who looks older, resigned and resentful, while Gautier, in order to maintain his worldly and professional success, does everything to look, dress and behave as someone younger than his age. Gautier's aesthetics, moreover, mirrors his ethics. Unlike Serge, who patronizes the soap opera actor on questions of diction and comprehension, Gautier doesn't care for Louis Jouvet's famous lessons on the best way to play a classical comedy, and especially Molière's Misanthrope. All he cares for is to capitalize on its canonicity and reach a wider audience, or, as he professes, touch its heart, as if spiting Bergson's famous definition of comedy as a genre that provokes a momentary anesthesia of the heart. That issues of the actor's age are a hidden line of interest in this film comedy is further corroborated by two significant episodes. Besides Francesca, in the village there is a young and sexy aspiring actress, Zoe, played by Laurie Bourdesoul, who, however, prefers a more lucrative career of a pornographic star. Although, when invited to rehearse the role of Célimène with the two actors, she proves to be very talented, eliciting in her companions both lust and sighs of admiration, expressing anticipated nostalgia for the talented youth so wasted. Moreover, when Serge one evening dances with Francesca, irritated by Gautier's attempts at seducing her with his knowledge of the Italian language, Francesca starts whispering in Serge's ear the famous lines in Dante's Divine Comedy. Nel mezzo del cammin della mia vita mi ritrovai in una selva oscura. Serge is, however, not in his 30s, as Dante's character is in the Divine Comedy. And even if one must admit that his retirement seems somewhat premature, he certainly feels the selva oscura of death approaching. Pretending that it is due to the feeling of betrayal by one of his previous best friends and movie directors, who now sues him for having left the set before the film has been finished, just like Alceste is sued in the Misanthrope, if you remember. And just like Serge himself is again running the risk to be sued by Gautier. Serge, in fact, belies his feelings of epochal maladjustment. During the rehearsals, he explodes over Gautier's dependence upon the mobile phone calls. He is not able to understand the universal irreverence when it comes to Molière and Jouvet's legacy, and he is horrified by the vacuity of soap operas through which Gautier gained his popularity, not to speak of X films, which the young Zoe wants to star in. The uses of classical comedy and of his acting expertise seem to him to be no longer valid and deservedly appreciated. When he decides to come to Gautier's party, dressed as a true 17th century nobleman, the anachronism is complete. Infuriated by some bystanders who entreat him to recite a couple of verses from the comedy in order to entertain them, Serge provokes the final scandal before the entire crew of fellow actors, comforted in finding the situation and the verses he so likes to be confirming the rigid view that he had all along, since the beginning of the plot, of a humanity irrevocably heading towards not only a moral, but also a cultural disaster. In a way, the end of the film does him justice, for in the penultimate scene of the film, we see Gautier playing Alceste to a rather mediocre, anonymous actor as Villain, and suddenly realizing that he, Gautier, made a mistake in diction, which had been repeatedly pointed to him by Serge during their rehearsals, a mistake that prevents him from continuing the performance. On the other hand, the very last scene that follows shows us Serge, Alceste, on a desert beach, reciting the same verses concerning the hatred of humanity with an expression of utter, epiphanic, though also, of course, somewhat melancholic exhilaration on his face. And now, to conclude. Despite its overall light atmosphere, which measuredly mixes the inserted recitations of classical Alexandrines with characteristic phrasings of a contemporary dialogue, the film thus manages to re-actualize, if not further complicate, the paradox and ambiguity of the original comedy. Since here the melancholic protagonist not only takes himself to be the sole guardian of the dying spirit of classical comedy, but also insists that its current devaluation is no laughing matter. To play with the famous essay on melancholy by Freud a bit, we might say that just as Serge, the actor, incorporates Molière's comedy as the lost object of his desire and mourning, and delights in ritually evoking its verses despite the fact that there is no audience to watch him and listen to him, so also the film incorporates substantial parts of the misanthrope, running the same risk as its protagonist, since the release of the film has unfortunately been accompanied by the same remarks regarding its own epochal maladjustment, its overblown allegiance to Molière, which might intimidate modern viewers. The question remains, is the grande comédie, or the comedy of character, thereby rejuvenated or turned off? Before we rush to proclaim the French 17th century character comedy to be anachronistic, we should perhaps lend our ears to recent analysis of the regulatory force with which the contemporary neoliberal capitalism displays a certain turn to character, as Kim Allen and Anna Hall recently called its moral effects, an ideology that is imposing certain affective, cultural and psychic features as the right kind of dispositions for surviving in society. Confidence, resilience and positive mental attitude, let alone, we would add, availability to constant gregariousness and overall alertness in social networking. all qualities more pertaining to youth and its promises than to the old age. Any comedy that attempts to truly engage with this ideology, therefore, inevitably faces the task of humorously exposing its repressed content, namely the resulting marginalization of the melancholic inadaptability, introversion, and aging as such. But even if we accepted the strain the genre thus suffers, for its tradition is to celebrate youth and its victories over decrepit elders, simply focusing on the maladjustment of aging and willfully solitary individuals in contemporary neoliberal society hardly makes for a truly daring comedy challenging the status quo. Having in mind the warnings that by referring to Molière's Misanthrope, the film itself runs the risk of alienating the modern audience, I will therefore suggest that, to use the typology suggested by Alenka Zupancic, her opposition between the truly provocative stand-up and the conformist sit-down, what she calls sit-down comedy. The kind of stand-up effect that Alceste bicyclette performs has perhaps also a lot to do with the current conundrum pertaining to cultural hierarchies and with the overall, academic included, enthusiasm for all things popular, inevitably entailing the supposed anachronism of the very classical comedy that both ridiculed a melancholic stance and, by making it subversive of any kind of institutional repression, consecrated its provocative potential in the first place. Once again, therefore, the invocation of the Misanthrope reinstates the crisis of moral and aesthetic judgment that once upon a time made it so modern, making any taking sides with the characters uneasy, a challenge to choose the kind of cultural capital one would like to be associated with, and upon choosing, the kind of risk to be exposed to be denounced either as a stubborn, conservative, narrow-minded and inflexible classicist, or as a calculating, fashion-driven liberal, if not pseudo-leftist populist. Now, if such troubling of the high-minded audience is not a true calling of comedy, I don't know what is. Thank you.
Such a dense presentation with full of references and full of ideas certainly evoke certain questions. So if you have any, please take.
I have about 75, but
75 questions.
No, I'm just joking. I'll ask the first one. One of the things that fascinates me in case of displays, you were talking about two different temperaments that Alceste could be seen as representing. Now, the French tradition didn't necessarily relate on humors the way that the English did.
Yes, they did. They did to a large extent. Bile and phlegma. They
yeah,
they
do, but not as
not
much
as
as French job. Because, for instance,
Johnson,
Molière still uses Aristotelian terminology in Philant's discussion earlier when they have that. But I'm curious, do you think that if he is seen as choleric versus melancholy, that changes the perception of the character? I've often been wondering, like when you watch, Shakespeare had his own version of comic melancholy characters. Maybe not as Jacob. So we have that character, and Hamlet. If you watch Hamlet, Hamlet has some of the best lines, very funny too. So he already has that. But is it possible? Because you ended. I was paying attention to what you were saying. You ended with, I think in your conclusion, you described him as melancholy, as opposed to as choleric. And you were saying earlier that if he's choleric, that he would be seen as funnier if he is seen as primarily choleric and more tragic.
Absolutely. In the film, I think that this melancholic undertone prevails. Whereas in the original comedy, I think it's precisely the vision of Alceste as a comic type that would be a choleric one. And one can imagine that Molière played him as, and rather the exegesis that followed, the reception, wanted to see in him a melancholic, because philosophers were great melancholics. So I think that whoever emphasized the philosophical aspect of the play tended to see in Alceste a melancholy. And even you know, contemporary critics like Gossman, he wants to see the whole age as a melancholic age, but I think it's a later projection when it comes to the comedy. Whereas, in fact, it's a choleric. He's a choleric. If we use this yes, humor kind of.
I mean, would be interesting to see which other words Molière uses to describe him, because that is sometimes clue to how they saw it in the 17th century.
In the 17th, the subtitle is Atrabilaire amoureux. So it's bile, and Philinte explicitly says, your bile may be philosophical, but my phlegma is as philosophical as your bile. So he is really seen as someone whose internal suffering makes him, you know, make this. I can only imagine abrupt, you know, expressions, gestural and mimic. I imagine him like this in Molière's interpretation, not necessarily a modern one. Of course, there are reasons, but one should also know that there is a certain layering of interpretation that made him into a melancholic, and that it flagrantly sometimes contradicts situations in which he's.
Yes, that makes sense. Just one other quick question. Where do you stand on his age? Because I thought there was a counterintuitive argument to make him seem in his 20s. Yes. Molière only played really older characters in his 20s?
There are many, I think, arguments to say. Even, you know, I'm always inclined to think about this comedic slot, the comedic structure, the inherited structure, and the tradition of Molière's protagonist really puts Alceste closer to Arnolphe than to a jeune premier.
Yeah.
But there is something in between, because it is true. It is a kind of, you know, also subversion of this classical jeune premier marries the most beautiful woman in, and still we are not quite sure whether Célimène loves him or not. So there are plenty of reasons to think that still he has an appeal, much more than Arnolphe has for Agnès. So yes, middle age. Yes, middle age.
Thank you.
As far as I know, he was first played by Molière, and I think that Molière dedicated this role after to Baron.
Yes.
And it changed completely. Baron changed so Baron made him tragic, whereas Molière made him comic, but also young.
Yes.
So he, this ambivalence was already, as far as I know, this inscribed by Molière, because he had a vision of these two different.
No,
and I think this is I think this is. I mean, that's why he's so interesting, because he really can be perceived in very different ways.
That's why I opted for middle age, because it's an age where you can, you know, appear younger or older than you
and
are.
besides, you mentioned Célimène might love him, but also Eliane loves him.
Definitely.
Definitely, and
Arsinoe also offers
so
herself.
he is loved. He is perceived as someone
Charming and yes. Absolutely, I agree. I'm for ambivalence.
Yeah.
For the two first variants, A and B, you know, precarious balance. That's why it's so interesting and interpretable in many different ways.
What do you think, how much does this eagerness of interprets to interpret it in this melancholic, more philosophical way provides this outcome that there are many more interpretations that tends to put it in a tragic way? Because of course when we are interpreting such a piece, it's sort of easier to apply philosophy, to apply ideas when you put it in one way.
Yes, and it also has to do with what Professor Gunther said at the beginning. We somehow tend to think that seriousness is more lofty, more ambitious. That's the problem. In Croatia, we have the same thing with the fortune of Držić. Everybody wants to put Držić in a very, very serious manner on stage, but it is a comedy with, yes, many, many serious issues at stake, but still a comedy. And that's, I think, where true heroes, true heroic directors can excel. So I think it has a lot to do with the hierarchy, also with our appreciation of everything serious as being somehow more demanding, intellectually more demanding. And the second reason, of course, also is that whole reference frame, you know, philosophy, psychoanalysis. You can add whatever you want, and there's always this risk that if you put it in a comedic way, that it will slide into farce, and that people will not get these other aspects. But that, that's
but
what.
If I understand correctly, your opinion is that the misanthrope should be staged in a comic way, with this melancholy subtone visible, but somehow.
Yes, yes. Well, one should play with this. When you say precarious balance, it offers a lot of freedom, I think, for interpretation, both for actors and for directors.
You know, one other thought I've had, the big damage in terms of the reception of the misanthrope was done by Rousseau, like you mentioned earlier, because and it kind of coincides with the rise of psychology first and then psychiatry as a profession. Because if you think in terms of what humors do, they are states of what we would call today their mental health issues. So excess of humor, if it makes you melancholy, depressive, it's seen as negative. You should treat that as opposed to do it different. I mean, there's so many interpretations, but what I really like is what you just suggested. The natural extension of Arnolf, I think, in this particular case. They are both, the tricky bit about the reception, the perceiving, because I fully believe it's funny. What's the point otherwise? The perception that you have to be stupid in order to be funny. Is Alceste is very clever. That's really, and so is Arnolf. I mean, Arnolf is more stereotypical old man, but afterwards, and then you end up with, I mean, not end up because it was written before, but with Tartuffe, which is a similar issue too. People struggle with it. I like that.
But I agree entirely, and also when you mentioned psychology, the tendency, that's why I was saying, you know, realistic, it's really a very unfortunate word, but of course there is a certain psychological depth into all these characters. But why? Because they're placed in such complex situations. For comedy, it's the structure and the situations in which the characters are put that reveal various aspects of their personality, which has to be maintained. And all these situations are funny. So destroying the funny aspect destroys, in fact, the structure of the comedy. So the prevalence of you know, isolating characters and analyzing them, you know, extracting them from the texture of the play, also is to blame. One has to, and that's why I like Orlando. Orlando, when he does, he is a psychoanalytic critic, but when he does it a very close analysis of each and every line, and you know, connects lines from different parts of the comedy, pairs them to make us aware how everything is, you know, it's a proper structuralist reading, you know, everything is connected, and how the structure is important. And the structure reveals that comedic repression of the seriousness. Thank you so much, so much.